Anyway, let's crack into things. To kick things off for day two, our first speaker today is the National Party spokesperson for climate change and local government. Please welcome Simon Watts.
Thanks, Jack. Cheers, mate. Well, kia ora and a very good morning, everyone. It is, I don't know what it is, but last year I got the day two first slot event as well, and so it's interesting. What I can see is those that come into the back of the room as they drag in after the after party last night. But look, it is great to have all of you here this morning. Thank you very much for being here. And what a great evening it was last night, I think, to reflect on a number of the award winners in particular, in terms of the contribution to their sector, was very much inspiring, and for us as the National Party being here in person for the last 2 days and being able to talk and listen to you as a sector has been hugely valuable, and hopefully you have got a little bit of the same. The purpose of my overview this morning is to give you an outline in regards to the National Party's position around climate change. I am the Member of Parliament for North Shore. That is, for any of those that don't know where that is in New Zealand, it is Devonport and Takapuna, the northern beaches of Auckland, as I refer to my Sydney or Australian colleagues, but a beautiful part of the country. Shadow Minister for Climate Change, Local Government, Regional Development Statistics, and also Associate Finance and Infrastructure. So I don't know what Christopher Luxon was thinking, but he seems to give me some challenging portfolios, only having been an MP for 2.5 years. But love that, and climate change for me is a really important aspect. I'm a father and a dad of 2 young boys, aged 10 and 12. I said in my maiden speech how I will be judged when I choose to retire in the future, and they will no doubt ask me, Dad, what did you do in regards to what you could control in your role as a Member of Parliament, and hopefully post 15th of October, a Minister within the future government. And the reality is what we do and don't do in the next 3, 6 and 9 years in regards to climate change will absolutely dictate the pathway in regards to the success and unlocking the opportunity that we have as a country. Because climate change is a critical challenge of our time, and climate change and the boldness required around policy in regards to climate change emission reduction under national is going to be a significant focus. And you heard from our leader, Christopher Luxon, yesterday in regards to the infrastructure announcement policy. I think a comprehensive 5-point plan. I had a role of drafting and writing the city regional deals component of that model. I think one of the potentially transformational frameworks and structures that will unlock infrastructure delivery in this country for decades to come. And I'm hugely excited about what that aspect can play. But the reality is, getting back in terms of climate change, a national-led government, all options are on the table, right? That is critically important. And the role in which government needs to play is absolutely acknowledging that we need to, in many cases, get out of the way of industry to allow them to progress and get on with what they need to do. I think about the challenge around emission reduction, like going to the Tepid Baths in Auckland or the swimming pool, right? And I'm not a big swimmer, but in the context of swimming lanes, there's a fast lane, sort of a medium lane and a slow lane, right? And when you think about industries and the challenges that they have around reducing climate emissions, there is industries that are in the fast lane, and other ones that there is an opportunity in front of them today that's available, that all they need to do is to transition rapidly and get on board with that change. And when I think about that, and when we think about that as a party, we think about Electrify New Zealand, right? That is a component which is very much low-hanging fruit in terms of the challenge around emission reduction. And that's why it has formed the basis of one of the most significant policy announcements that we've done on climate change already this year. The middle lane is the aspects which we see, look, there's solutions and options available, but they're a little bit more difficult to achieve. They're not impossible, and they do have a solution available. It might not necessarily be here in New Zealand, but the opportunity exists somewhere. And the challenge there for industry is around potentially creating a regulatory framework which allows and unlocks that opportunity. And then you've got the slow lane, and don't feel bad if you're in the slow lane, right? It's not, sometimes you're in the slow lane because the reality is no one in the world has a solution to your challenge yet. And that is the case for a number of our industries. But a number of those industries play an absolutely critical and integral role in regards to both food security or energy security. We cannot underestimate the geopolitical challenges that the Asia-Pacific region may face in the next decade and beyond. And we are acutely aware for that. We are an export-led nation. We are a primary sector-led nation. We are a food producer. And food security is driven and linked intrinsically to energy security. And so we do need to be considering that in the context of our climate reduction opportunities. But more importantly, climate change reduction and emission reduction in a New Zealand context is not a significant challenge or a burden or something that's really, really hard. Yes, it is, but actually we should be looking at it as an opportunity to grow our economy. The opportunity that faces us in regards to climate change and emission reduction in agriculture is one of the single most opportunities as a country in terms of global stage of where we can and should and be ambitious around leading the research and development and the technology investment that will solve some of those most complex and gnarly problems that no one else on the globe has solved yet. We should be the country, and we can be the country in order to lead on that. And so a national-led government will be looking at the way in which we can unlock that opportunity, make it easier for our industries, and particularly our private sector, our Fonterras, our big players in that, to do what is required. And we'll be talking more around our agricultural emissions and other policies. And this is a standard one-liner for all politicians 133 days out from the election. You'll hear more about this soon, closer to the election. But I'll tell you here, ladies and gentlemen, it's not too far away, because agricultural emissions is a single most, or is one of the complexity areas that we cannot simply put to the side and ignore, right? We need to come out with a bold plan around how we deal with that. And a national-led government will and has got views around how that will happen. Climate change is obviously not a distant problem, right? It is a reality. It's happening right now. I come from the North Shore of Auckland and Milford, if anyone's been there. This is an urban part of Auckland City. Yet I had just under 100 of my homes in my electorate red or orange stickered post the floods on the 27th of January. A metre of water went through most of those homes, uninhabitable. This is an urban Auckland scenario. So the complex and the reality of climate change and the impacts of climate change has been felt across New Zealand. The Hawke's Bay, all round, many regions has that impact been felt. And so, the evidence is absolutely there. The challenge on government really in regards to what we do is what is that pathway and framework that we need to have in place to deal with the impacts of climate change, and particularly significant and adverse weather events as we move forward. Because the scale of this challenge is probably one of the single biggest fiscal challenges that our Crown balance sheet potentially could face in the next 30 years, right, and beyond. This is not a short game. This is a marathon, not a sprint. It is a long term. It is a 20, 50, 100-year challenge. But the challenge of these weather events and the need for us to have a comprehensive framework to be able to deal with that, and not just central government. You heard yesterday in the announcement by Christopher Luxon around a new partnership and collaborative partnership model between central government, local government, private sector, community organisations, iwi Māori. We need all of the stakeholders around that table to be dealing and coming up with a mechanism for us to deal with the impacts of climate change and weather events. Look, National has a proud history in regards to taking climate change and this issue seriously. In 2015, obviously the last National government signed us up to the Paris Climate Accords. We worked closely with the government around the Zero Carbon Act. My predecessor, Todd Muller, in regards to climate change, worked very closely with the Honourable James Shaw in regards to getting consensus across the political spectrum. We've heard a lot over the last, or yesterday in particular, around bipartisan, right? I mean, some use bipartisan as a tool to, in effect, dilute the reality is that we are a democracy. We have two views and we don't agree all the time. Actually, that's part of democracy. Having a strong opposition actually keeps the government on the straight and narrow, and I think we should protect that metrics. But we don't agree on all aspects. But in regards to the core components around how we will manage climate change, in regards to the ETS model, we are consistent and on the same page in terms of that. And National have been very clear around supporting and continue to support, and absolutely are unequivocal about that, in regards to our net zero 2050 climate goals. The current government, though, and I won't be too political in this, but I will note that, and that's a bit of an understatement when it comes from a Member of Parliament, I'm not going to be too political, but the reality is that there has been a lot of rhetoric, there has been a lot of talk, and I think one of the challenges when you get out on the ground is people go, yeah, that's all good, but I want to see action. I want to see delivery. I want to see tangible delivery that isn't just bumper sticker and headline. And I think that is not only in the climate change space, but that is across the board, because people's appetite around more talk and not much do is no longer there. And I think it is not lost on us in regards to why you're seeing us come up with comprehensive, deep thinking policy that actually deals with some of the most significant issues that we face. The other aspect, just touching around, is the government's climate response emergency fund. And I think this is a significant fiscal fund. The issue politically, and we heard before around that infrastructure pipeline and how do you get it to a point where actually it's sort of depoliticised. But that emergency fund has been used in regards to funding of what would be considered pet projects. The free public transport for young people sounds lovely, right? But when you actually get to, does it significantly reduce climate change emissions in order to help us achieve the thing? It is a tiny consequence in regards to that. So, we're not interested in doing stuff like that. We are actually interested in allowing the ETS model to do its job, get government out of the way, but really work with those industries that I referred to at the start that are in the slow lane, or even the ones that are in the middle lane, and just trying to work with them collaboratively around unblocking the pipe. And for those that are in the fast lane, then working with them, not against them, in order to encourage them to transition and transform at pace and increase the pace and the step change of their transition. Because actually the reality is, for many in that sector, it is an expectation, and the social license to do nothing no longer exists. And so I think in many cases the public have already moved on, and beyond that there is an expectation that should have occurred, and companies and corporates and entities that have not got out of the blocks, that do have that ability to do so, will pay the price, I think, particularly by consumers, as that just the consumer behaviour and the social licence aspect changes. Look, when we talk about meeting our climate change targets and emissions, National are very clear that we want to be laser focused around how much we, and every dollar that we spend needs to reduce emissions. We say that we need to reduce emissions in a sensible way. And what that means in reality is, as I said before, working with industry, not against it. Playing to the areas of which government have strengths, which is primarily the ability to remove regulation or put in place regulation, or leverage the Crown balance sheet. Those are probably the two key areas of value that can be brought to the table, and we need to play to the strengths of the other players around the table. I'm not interested in being in a government that's going to be writing massive cheques to profitable multinationals. I couldn't not mention that today, but we know, the headlines in regards to what we saw in the steel industry. as someone with a banking background and in global banking markets background offshore, the challenge when government starts throwing in what I refer to as dumb crown capital into the market, it sends signals to other market players around, and often delaying investment by those other players, because it's like, well, if I just sit back and wait, maybe the Crown's going to write me a cheque as well. And that mis-signalling, or that signalling around investment by the Crown and subsidies into a market where their solution already exists, actually can create friction and inefficiencies in the market. And for those that are involved in the electricity sector, the reality is if government just kept out of the sector, we probably wouldn't face the number of the significant issues that we often do. And it's often when government tries to get in and tries to fix the problem and not let the market do what the market needs to do, that we have significant issues. So addressing that aspect is critical. For us, addressing the energy generation aspect around renewable energies is the first and most important aspect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We need to rapidly invest in renewable energy sources such as solar, wind and geothermal power. And also within that we have included hydro as well. National wants a future model where our transport system is powered by green renewable electricity. When you go away on holiday and you plug in your electric vehicle, that is energy, powered by renewable energy. When you jump on a plane, and in New Zealand and other companies are doing and looking at that in terms of the biofuel conversation. Another opportunity for New Zealand in regards to moving and reducing our emissions. But the challenge at the moment is that we need to double our renewable energy generation that we produce in this country. The advantage that we have over our neighbours across the water is that actually we have an abundance of natural resources in order to do this. So this goes back to right at the start. This is one of our single biggest opportunities as a country in order to get in behind and invest in renewable energy infrastructure. And the reality is, at the moment, the current policy settings actually make it more difficult in order to achieve that, not easier. The other decision that the government made in haste was the banning of the oil and gas deposits, and doing that basically overnight. That sent a signal primarily to offshore markets around uncertainty in the New Zealand market. But as a result of that, and as someone who lives on the north shore of Auckland and can see those boats as they come in down the harbour each day, those boatloads of Indonesian coal that are coming in at a significant volume, we've now got what I refer to as coal-powered Teslas driving around the streets of Auckland, when in reality we should have been able to strategically see the opportunity around maintaining our flow of gas and using gas instead of coal in order to deal with our energy generation needs as a country, while we bought time in order to increase more renewable generation options. And so that is a disappointment and outcome of, I think, of a poor policy decision around that. But we need to acknowledge that while we're moving away from fossil fuels, we also need to be pragmatic and acknowledge that we are going to still need these fuels in some places. And around 40% of our emissions come from energy, making it our second largest emission area behind agriculture, and the majority of that comes from transport. So there are significant opportunities in order to reduce climate emissions through reduction in transport emissions. But we need to make sure that we're looking in the right places. National will turbocharge new wind, geothermal, solar and power plants by setting a 1-year limit for consents decisions. 1 year for consent decisions in regards to those projects. Allowing consents to last for 35 years, not 10 years, which is the current thing. This whole model of reconsenting a hydro power plant, does anyone believe that that is Common sense. Do you think we're going to close down one of our hydro power plants because it didn't meet a consent requirement? No, of course not. I mean, it's like when we look at ports and we say, well, actually, are we going to reconsent a port or not? No, we're not. But the process of that consenting, and with respect, I'm sure there's a few consultants in the room that probably do quite well out of those processes. It does add no value at a country level. And all it does is distract our industries from core business. And so we've been very clear that we need to unleash the transmission and distribution infrastructure. We've also included within that the lines, pylons and poles required for electricity generation. We're going to scrap the requirements to upgrade existing assets. I mean, it seems ridiculous that you've got pylons carrying electricity and we have to reconsent those pylons, right? I mean, that's just dumb. So we've said we're going to scrap that. And Christopher Luxon and I, along with Chris Bishop, who is in the room, I understand, we had a look at Meridian's wind farm in Wellington. And this farm produces enough wind power, renewable energy to power 75,000 homes. It took 2 years to build, but 8 years to consent. Yeah? 8 years to consent, 2 years to build. Ladies and gentlemen, if we are serious about the need to reduce climate change emissions, then we need to be dealing with what is blocking that pipe. And the consenting regime under this government is a major barrier. And so that's why our policy, Electrify New Zealand, clears that out of the way. And that is just one example. I've spoken to many in the room and around the country in regards to offshore wind opportunities, opportunities in terms of solar across the country, and the frustration and the challenge often gets back to the uncertainty and the timeline around the consenting. So we have got a policy that will clear that out of the way, and I think that is hugely exciting. I think that is a practical and pragmatic policy intervention that clears the pipe and allows us to get on and do what we need to do. The challenge as well, and we can talk for anyone who comes to the breakout session later on, where we'll be talking about a little bit about RMA, and I know it's not necessarily the topic that we want to start the day with after a big night last night, but RMA is probably one of the single biggest challenge areas that we face, and the government's policy in regards to RMA that's currently on the table will make things worse, not better. The CEO of Contact Energy, when discussing this proposal at the Select Committee, and I quote, "If the bill passes in its current form, then you can kiss goodbye to our decarbonisation goals. It is simple as that," close quote. Yeah? So be under no illusion in regards to the RMA reform on the table. A national government will implement consenting reform as outlined in Electrify New Zealand and in other areas of infrastructure as well to unblock that pipe. Instead of making it harder to produce renewable energy, National will make it easier. We also need, as I said, that renewable generation and transmission consents to be issued within 1 year. And as I said, reconsenting for generation and transmission issues to also be issued within 1 year. But the extension of that time period out to 35 years really provides certainty to the market. The one thing that central government can do, with the exception of changing the weather, is pretty much everything else. We can implement regulation, we can take it away. We can provide through regulation certainty. And the single biggest thing that I hear when I walk around and I visit businesses across the country is we need certainty and simplicity from government policy, and a long-term pipeline that supports that with a commitment, particularly around funding and financing and procurement. We have heard that loud and clear, and as a result, our infrastructure policy yesterday puts that very clearly around that as the direction of travel that we will flow. In regards to making it easier to build and invest in renewable energy, our policy will reduce one of the most significant bottlenecks in this space, but it will also allow us to put in place a new national policy statement for renewable energy generation and introduce national environmental standards for each type of renewable generation. to make it clear to applicants whether their plans for renewable generation will be considered. This lack of certainty or lack of clarity around whether a project will be successful or not is also a key challenge in regards to that. So we need to do what we can to increase the transparency to the sector while ensuring that the standards that we have are high and upheld. And Electrify New Zealand is one where it is easier and cheaper than ever to buy and operate an EV, to turn a heater on in your home, all while lowering our emissions in the energy sector. And it also, and importantly in the current environment, deals with the underlying, or one of the significant underlying drivers around the cost of living crisis. Energy costs, and you can see in Europe particularly, the lack of energy security and the implications of energy costs is one of the single biggest drivers around cost of living. And that is not lost on us here in New Zealand as well. The more abundance that we have of energy coming into the sector means that we are able to ensure that New Zealanders can continue to enjoy energy at prices which is affordable, and in ways actually mitigate some of the impacts around the cost of living implications of which energy drives everything, right? It's not just the heating of the home. Without energy, we don't have food, and it implicates in regards to the food prices that we pay at the supermarket. We're also looking to make the sector more resilient, and I know that word's used probably a little bit overused in regards to the challenges, particularly here in this city in regards to its history. But our experience around the impacts of climate change and more extreme weather events means that we are going to need to have more resilience in regards to our infrastructure, particularly around energy, and that is critically important as well. Electrify New Zealand is just one piece of our climate change policy. We will be releasing more climate change policies in regards to a number of key areas that I've highlighted this morning in the coming weeks and months. We've also announced our local water done well policy, which is our solution around water infrastructure. I'll talk a little bit about that later on this morning at another session. But it is clear that anyone caught up in the implications around Cyclone Gabrielle, that water infrastructure is also a key issue. And what sits behind all of these issues in regards to infrastructure and the challenge of dealing with climate change is around the funding aspects. And we do acutely acknowledge the role that our local councils play. They have done an absolute tremendous role, and I acknowledge some of the mayors in the room. Alex, I see you from down there. Your region, one of the most significantly impacted regions. And without our local government leadership, who stepped up to the plate and did what they did, our communities would have been and will be in a much significantly worse place than they are. Wellington cannot deal with the issues in which local government members and their communities deal with. Local people understand their communities better than anyone. And often the challenge for central government is get out of your way, get you the tools and resources that you need. But I do commend the work that those within that sector have done. So the infrastructure challenge is significant. It links in regards to our overall objectives around climate change. The only way that we can meet our challenges of climate change is, one, making sure that we firstly make sure that we're focused around productivity that puts us in a position which reduces our emissions, and making sure that the investments we need to reduce our emissions are occurring. And secondly, as I said, we need to ensure that we've got resilient and sustainable infrastructure, which means that we can be prepared for those future climate events that we impact. We can't necessarily flip on and off the sea level rise switch or prevent extreme weather events, but we can build now so that those that will be affected by that are best prepared and are safe from the devastating effects of that change. National has an ambitious policy platform, and while I'm excited to share some of the policy that we've released already, I'm also more excited in regards to looking forward to what is to come. We will make more announcements in regards to infrastructure and climate change in the coming weeks. Climate change represents one of our most significant challenges. But if we invest now, if we build now, we can meet that challenge. We can become a global world leader in regards to this. We can make this one of our most significant opportunities and strengths of this country. And I think the challenge that sits in front of us all in this room and those outside is the ability for us to work together in order to make this happen. So thank you very much and have a good morning.
You've cunningly left me very little time for questions.
Well, Jack, I know you too well, so you're a tough man behind the interview.
Heaps of questions. Thanks for submitting those via Slido. I'm going to go to the top of the list because the way Slido works is everyone can upvote questions. How is National going to achieve the emissions reductions goals by expanding city boundaries and building more roads to green fields?
Well, look, and I think what the question is referring to is the housing policy that we've come out recently. One of the most significant challenges around the cost and the affordability of housing is land. And our policy very much deals with that challenge and allows the urban boundary to expand. The impact around climate is acknowledged. We're absolutely supportive of intensification around urban transport links. North Shore, Smales Farm, we've got the Northern Busway. That makes sense. But we don't need to have a 6-storey home on Takapuna Beach. You know, it needs to be correlated with transport hubs. So intensification where it makes sense, but also allowing the urban boundary to sprawl to allow us to basically allow more affordable housing. Because the challenge for many young Kiwis is, the decision around buying a house is out of touch, and that shouldn't be the case.
I suppose it doesn't totally answer the question though. Like, you acknowledge, as your party's climate change spokesperson, that further expanding city boundaries and further expanding sprawl will ultimately lead to higher emissions.
Look, we acknowledge there are trade-offs, right? And there are trade-offs in every decision to make. And I don't think it's one or the other. We are pro and supportive of intensification around transport hubs in our urban areas. But we also acknowledge that there is a significant need for young people in this country to be able to afford to buy their own home. And the blockage of that is the price of land, and the driver of that is the urban boundary, particularly in our urban centres. And so we are simply addressing those two aspects. We believe that actually with policy intervention around electrifying New Zealand and renewable energy and all that, we can meet our energy reduction, climate change reduction targets. But look, it's not one or the other.
Well, except that the trade-off, I suppose, for more affordable housing, the way the National Party sees it, is that ultimately it means greater emissions than the alternative. Yeah,
but look, in regards to the opportunity for Kiwis to be able to afford to buy their own home, we can't simply put our head in the sand and say, well, everything's fine, and by not allowing that growth, that, actually, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to afford to buy your own home. I mean, that is not the New Zealand that I think Kiwis are wanting for. We've got to balance those two aspects. We've got to reduce emissions in a sensible way, but it is not a case of one or the other.
How do you see the balance between investing in new roads and investing in new public transport?
Well, look, we're pro around both aspects. Actually, we're mode agnostic in terms of how we get. But, we are an export-led country. We're a primary sector-led country. We need to be able to get our goods from farms to port. We need to have those resilient corridors to allow us to trade and move goods around. But in our urban centres, in Auckland particularly, we've got to have good and reliable public transport options available. The Northern Busway is a great example of that. And our option is well, we need to look at more options to increase mass rapid transport in our urban centres. But that's not, again, at the cost of no roads in rural and provincial New Zealand. Because how do we get our goods to port, particularly in regions which have been impacted by the natural disasters? Dairy farms in the West Coast are shut off for weeks and weeks and weeks because the roads are unable to be travelled on and they can't get their goods to market. We've got to get that balance.
Talk to us about what you see as being the role of the ETS in achieving our climate targets.
Yeah, look, National are absolutely supportive around the ETS model. We support a market-led approach in regards to climate change emissions. Are there areas in which the ETS could be improved? Yes. and we are open to that, and some of our future policy will be around looking at opportunities to enhance. I think it is upon us to continually look at how it can be better, but in terms of an ETS and a market-driven model, we are absolutely committed to that, and we see it as probably one of our single biggest positive attributes as a country around having that model.
Yeah, you talked earlier about in order for markets to function properly, you have to remove government interventions. So does that mean that National would support reducing the number of free credits and the number of interventions in the ETS?
Yeah, well, I used the example in my speech around the fast, the medium and the slow lane at the swimming pool and the industries that sit within those buckets. Our view is that actually, we're a party of limited government. And so the intervention that government should be making is where there is market failure, right? Where the market is unable to achieve that outcome. There is a huge amount of opportunity within the current state where the government do not need to get involved, but we can, in renewable energies example, clear the consenting and the requirements, just allow industry to get on and do the doing. And so that's where we want to be focused on, removing those barriers that are slowing us down, that will equip us with the options in the future to be able to deal with what's coming down the track. And for many of us, that will be more electrification, both at home but also at work and into business.
Heaps more questions here, including several on...
We're going for another hour.
Yeah, several on... Well, no, I think we've got to
okay.
keep moving for timing reasons. Several here regarding consents that may be required for hydro operations in the future. So perhaps if you've got those questions, you can see Simon outside in the morning tea break and hit him up with those. You've got another session today. But for the time being, won't you join me in thanking National's climate spokesperson, Simon Watts.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks. Good job.
Good to see you, mate.